So Trinidad, famous among biologists for being the home of the guppy. Here you have Robert John Lechmere Guppy, who named the guppy when he first discovered it in Trinidad, thinking that he'd found a new species, and they named it Guppii, only to then find months later that in fact it had already been described. So it lost the name Guppii, but has since then still been known as the guppy. And as well as Trinidad, you also find guppies in the northeastern edge of South America. So the Trinidadian guppy, Poecilia reticulata. Here's a female and a male. It's tropical freshwater, as I'm sure you're all aware. You find it all over Trinidad, south, northern range, east, west. It's interesting because it's a popular ornamental species, so it's been bred to be a bit more beautiful and is used as a pet globally. And it's also a popular model species, which means it's been used in biology for studying behavioural and evolutionary ecology. And when I say, so just to demonstrate just how much the guppy has been studied over the years, this is a graph to show the cumulative number of papers published in scientific journals since 1950 that include work on the guppy. And you can see that it's on the up. People are still finding new things to study about this fish. So although here it's regarded as just a fish that you find in all the drains, the drain fish, million fish, it's actually very valuable to scientists internationally. Now, the reason it's been so well studied in Trinidad is that Trinidad's northern range has these very convenient rivers with barrier waterfalls. So this picture here is of the Tururi, one of the Tururi falls. So guppies are found above and below these falls, and these are, along the northern range there are 7 of these barriers. Below the falls you find a lot of predators of guppies, so the, fish like this pike cichlid that will eat guppies and make life harder for them, whereas above the barriers those predators never manage to colonize, but the guppies do very well. They coexist up there with fish such as rivulus, the jumping wabine, who will eat young guppies but not the adults, and more is a competitor more than a predator perhaps. So you find guppies above and below these waterfalls, but they're very different populations above and below. So the guppies that you'll find above the barrier waterfalls have evolved very different behaviours and life histories depending whether they're above or below. Just to list a few of those differences, those that are downstream are genetically programmed to have more smaller babies. This is because a lot of them are going to be eaten, so to have more quickly is a better strategy. The males tend to be duller because the predators can see them, that they're more exposed to predators if they're more colourful. And the opposite is true in upstream. You find much more colourful males above these waterfalls where there are fewer predators. You find that guppies downstream with the predators tend to mature fast, have lots of babies and then die quite young because they're more likely to be predated upon. The opposite is true at upstream. And interestingly, in terms of behaviour, you find that adults in the downstream sites with lots of predators tend to shoal together a lot. And this is because this is a really good tactic for avoiding predators. You confuse the predators. There's also safety in numbers from the point of view of the predator will eat one of you, but the rest of you will survive. And you also find that guppies in these downstream sites are much quicker to respond to predators. So when a predator attacks a shoal of guppies, the downstream guppies will notice much more quickly and have the appropriate reaction. Whereas upstream, when they're not used to that, they're less well equipped to behave. And scientists have found this a fascinating system to work with for studying evolution. This is because you can do really neat experiments where you move fish from downstream and put them upstream, above the waterfall, and vice versa. And you can actually track the evolution, and over a few generations you find that the downstream guppies evolve to have more of these upstream characteristics and vice versa. So you'll find that often one of the criticisms of evolution by creationists is that you don't have very much evidence in our lifetime of evolution happening. Guppies are a brilliant example of, even within the lifetime of a human being, you can actually see measure evolution happening in these fish, which is extremely useful for a biologist. But actually, unusually for a scientist, a guppy scientist, I'm more interested in guppies outside of Trinidad. So my interest in guppies came from finding out that it was an invasive species when it leaves Trinidad. And you can see on this graph that over the last century, there's been a steady rate of introductions of guppies globally over the last 100 years or so. This point here marks the first discovery of the guppy in Barbados, which is thought, it's a bit controversial, but people believe that's an introduced population in Barbados, not native. And why should we care about invasive species? Well, I'm sure you're all aware that invasive species are one of the greatest threats to biodiversity. And even though only a small proportion of species that get introduced become invasive, those that do have a really devastating effect, both ecologically and economically. Some examples, apart from the guppy, we have the Nile perch in East Africa, in Lake Victoria. This was introduced as a food species, but went on to decimate the diverse cichlid species that you found in the lake. There used to be several hundred species of cichlid, and they were almost all wiped out during the 1980s. And this is the zebra mussel in the US. Now this is more of an economical issue, primarily, because this is what it does to industrial pipes. It clogs them up and costs hundreds of billions of pounds of damage over the decades. And then we all know about the lionfish, which has apparently now reached Tobago. This was introduced, some unwanted pets were introduced in Florida, and it's now spread down through the Caribbean. And because it enjoys predating on reef fish, it's having a potentially negative effect on the ecosystems, the coral reef ecosystems. So why are invasive guppies bad? Well, they compete very well with other species. They're they eat a wide variety of things. They compete for food. They reproduce quickly, so they compete for space. And the most interesting example of a negative effect of the guppy is in Mexico. Some colleagues of mine looked at invasive guppies in Mexico. And here you have a native fish that's endangered, Scyphia bilineata. And this fish, the female looks very similar to a female guppy, but a little bit larger. So the male guppies prefer the native fish female. And male guppies are so relentless in their courting, they actually prevent the native male from mating with their own females, because the male guppies monopolise the Scyphia females, which means that the breeding success of the endangered species is greatly reduced where guppies have been introduced, which is an unusual example of how invasive species can have a negative effect. Just to clarify what I mean by an invasive species, there's some terminology involved. So an invasive species first has to be introduced outside of its native range. So the guppy, in the case of the guppy, moved from Trinidad to another country, another habitat. In the case of the guppy, this is either by being introduced to the ornamental aquaria trade, and then being an unwanted pet that gets released. And equally, it's being released as a mosquito control agent. So in places like Africa and India, the guppy is actually released to consume the aquatic larvae of mosquitoes. So it's introduced deliberately. But of course, most species that are introduced can't survive. It's a new habitat, it's different to their native conditions, the temperature's not right, the food is not right, they get predated upon, they get competed with, and that's it. So an introduced species has to actually survive in the new place that they find themselves. They then need to establish a self-sustaining population, so breed and not require any further introductions to establish. And finally, they then need to spread from this initial area, this isolated area of introduction. And this is when they tend to have negative effects, and that's when we term them an invasive species. So as I said before, most species never make it to the end of this flowchart here for various reasons. And it's estimated that about 1 in every 1,000 introduction events results in an invasion. But guppies and other species, such as this cane toad, seem to have a much higher success rate than others. And I'm interested to find out why that is. So to give a bit of background to my studies, in 1981, Professor Kenny released a single pregnant guppy into his ornamental pond, just out of interest to see what would happen. 15 years later, a population was still thriving in this pond. And just to clarify, that was just one female that he put into that pond. And that raises some questions. So if we think about the guppy's biology, there are quite a lot of traits that might allow them to be so good at colonising. We can look at their behaviour. They're very flexible in their behaviour. Scientists have shown that they can learn how to avoid predators. They're very good at being able to learn new behaviours. They're phenotypically plastic, which means if they find themselves in a new environment, they can actually change their shape, their size, their life history, their behaviour in response to that. They're omnivorous, as I said before. They eat anything from algae to insects. They're very tolerant to fluctuating conditions such as temperature or salinity. And then, they have a high dispersal rate, so males will go downstream quite freely. And then these traits that I've highlighted here are what I'm going to concentrate on today. Guppies have a very short generation time, about 3 months from being born to being able to breed. So within 4 months, the babies are having babies. So that's 3 or 4 generations a year. They're oviviparous. Now this means they give birth to live babies, which is very unusual among fish. So the babies are born and are immediately prepared for life in the water. They don't need to be looked after. They're very good at avoiding predators immediately. They mate multiply, which means that females and males will mate with multiple other females and males. And they can store sperm. So a female will mate with a male, and 6 to 8 months later, she still has that sperm and can still produce broods using that sperm. So in situations where maybe in the dry season there are just small pools in the forest, a female finds herself alone, she's still perfectly able to establish a population there. And this could, as you can imagine, help in an invasive situation where very few guppies are released at one time. So I set out to find out whether a single female guppy really can establish a population and whether this is a repeatable thing we can establish. And at the same time, I thought it would be interesting to look at whether guppies from downstream populations are better or worse at colonising than those from upstream populations. And if you remember the slide where I showed you the differences between upstream and downstream populations, what you might predict is that guppies from downstream populations are having more babies more quickly, and this might be a really great advantage when they find themselves in a small population at the beginning of an introduction event. So my hypothesis might be that downstream populations are better at colonising than those from upstream populations. So this is what I did. Now this is a picture of the roof of the Life Sciences building at UE. So these are 30 tanks, which I've termed mesocosms because they're small worlds where they have some gravel, some plants, like a little mini guppy habitat. And I placed one single female in each of these tanks. And these were females that I caught from the wild. Half of the females I took from an upstream site, and the other half I caught in a downstream site. We didn't feed the guppies, these are open air, so we relied on algae growing and insects falling in and larvae and this sort of thing, which seemed to be fine. And we just left them there on the roof for 2 years. And we found that we had nearly a 90% success rate in terms of tanks establishing thriving populations of fish from that one single female. We found no difference in the establishment success or population size between the upstream and downstream founders. So this confirmed that guppies have this amazing ability to colonize, and it also showed us that it's not important necessarily whether it's an upstream or downstream population. So when guppies are exported abroad, any guppies from Trinidad have the same amazing ability to colonize a new habitat. But my next thought was maybe the number of mates these females have had is actually important. So in this study, I took females from the wild, but as I said before, they mate multiply and they store sperm. So I had no way of knowing how many males these females had actually mated with before I caught them. So perhaps that's important, and that led me to my next experiment. So just to reiterate, I still find this an amazing thing myself, that each brood a guppy has can have multiple fathers. So she can have 5 babies, and each one of those 5 babies would have a different father. And that's all based on storing sperm from multiple males. Now, in theory, this means that the population would have a lot of genetic variation. And when there's an introduction scenario, just a few fish are introduced, then what tends to happen is you have reduced genetic variation because only a few individuals are contributing their genes to the next generation. And this can be problematic. It can cause inbreeding and also decrease the adaptability of the population. So the obvious question to ask is whether multiply mated females are actually better at establishing a population because they're overcoming that reduction in genetics by allowing multiple males to contribute to the next generation. And maybe that population would be better equipped to invade because it won't be suffering from inbreeding, perhaps. So this is what I did. I took 40 virgin females, so I reared them so that they never mated with a male, so they definitely didn't have any sperm stored. That's the only way to be sure that females don't have any sperm stored, is to never allow them to even have contact with a male from their birth onwards, or at least from about a month after their birth. So half of them I allowed to mate with one male, and half of them I allowed to mate with 4 different males. And then I removed the males from the tanks and did the same thing as before, just left these females in 40 tanks, so 20 of each treatment. And after 1 year, again we had a really high success rate in terms of establishment and persistence of this population, just from one single female having babies, the babies mating with the babies, and continuing like that for a year. So you can see here there was no difference in the population size between the 2 treatments, just as before. So they were both excellent at establishing. But I was interested to see whether there might still be some evidence of inbreeding and whether these populations might be different in their ability to then spread, if you imagine that being in an introduced scenario in the wild. So I looked at 2 different things to investigate this. One was looking at the newborn behaviours. So newborns have innate anti-predator behaviours that you can test quite easily. So I thought if I saw reductions or less variation in these behaviours, that would be an indication of inbreeding. And the same with male courtship vigour. It's a common measure of inbreeding, so inbred males court much less vigorously. So for the courtship behaviour, we looked at 3 different behaviours. So guppies, one of the reasons guppies are so well studied, from the slide I showed you earlier of the number of papers that have been published, is that male mating behaviour is very distinct in guppies. It's really easy to measure, and that's because they do 3 very distinct behaviours. One is sneaky mating, and this is against the will of the female. The male will mate with the female, just sneaks up and mates with her before she's even realised it's happened. Sometimes just a touch of his gonopodium is enough to insert sperm. Sigmoid displays, that's a little bit more consensual. So the male does a very colourful display, forms a sigmoid shape, and becomes more intense in his colours, and the female is bedazzled and allows him to mate. There's also following behaviour, so the male will just chase the female for a long time until he's able to mate sneakily. So you can measure these things quite easily in the laboratory, in the tank. For the newborn behaviour, we had to do something a bit different. We had to take the females, so not the founder females, but the female descendants of those founding females, isolate them into ice cream tubs in the lab, and wait for them to have a brood of babies. As soon as they had a brood of babies, which about once a month, so if you keep them in these tanks for a month, most females will have a brood of babies. As soon as they do, scoop the babies out and perform some very easy tests on their behaviour. So one is schooling, which is to see how long within a certain period of time one newborn will associate with another one, stay very close. Another one is evasion ability, which involved me using this net here to try and catch the baby in that tray. So I timed myself how long the baby was able to avoid me catching it. It sounds very crude, but in fact it's a very repeatable, reliable way of measuring reaction time in guppies. Time and cover was to see whether this other ice cream tub at the bottom here, how long they spent in these gravelled areas in comparison with how long they spent in the clear areas. Activity was measured as how often they crossed between the gravelled areas and the clear areas to see how much they're moving around. And reaction distance, I just moved an object towards the baby to see at what point they reacted. And I actually found that babies from both treatments were equally good at avoiding predators. So all of those measures I said I've just described, there was no difference between single-mated, those that were the descendants of single-mated female founders, and those that were descending from multiply mated tanks. And the same with the males, they were courting just as vigorously, regardless of whether they descended from single or multiply mated tanks. So in other words, multiple mating doesn't seem to be necessary to establish a viable population. Even just 2 fish can manage. So it's amazing that even the descendants, a few generations down the line of a single female and male, are still able to court. There's no signs of inbreeding. They seem to be able to be quite robust when it comes to that. So taking these two studies put together, it's likely that a rapid increase in population size after a bottleneck, such as a bottleneck would be when just a few fish are introduced and then the population expands. That might be the key to establishment success. So the fact that guppies have large broods once a month and then have very short generation times allows them to expand the population extremely quickly in a new habitat. And the interesting thing here is that these mesocosms, although they seem quite artificial in one respect, they're not the same as a river, they're actually very similar to the type of water tanks that guppies are often introduced to in India and Africa, countries which use guppies for mosquito control. And what happens in these countries is that after a flood or a monsoon, tanks like this become flooded. These thriving populations of guppies in these tanks then find their way into natural ecosystems, and that's when they can have these devastating effects. And just to show you the result of the guppy's brilliant ability to colonize, this is the native range of Poecilia reticulata. So guppies are found in that northeastern edge of South America. This is quite generous because actually they probably don't extend quite that far down. I just have to colour in the whole countries. And I was interested to see how far they've spread now from that point. People knew that the guppy was found globally, but no one really had worked out their current range. So I sent over 500 questionnaires to fish biologists, conservation managers, people working who might know about fish. I just sent lots and lots of emails. I just Googled to find contact details and sent these emails out with a questionnaire. And I received nearly 200 replies, which I compiled with data that we did have from online databases, and found out this. So I'll talk you through this map. So you can still see the native range in green. The red countries are where the guppy is now well established in rivers and streams naturally. So you find it in every continent apart from Antarctica. The orange areas are where it's highly likely it's established, but we can't be absolutely sure. The yellow is where it probably is not established. We've got good reports saying it's not there. And the hatched areas, you might be surprised to see those hatched, and that's because the guppy is found in these countries, but in very isolated areas, normally next to geothermal waterways or next to factories where there's a hot outflow of water, which allows guppies they've been introduced and they've actually survived in these sort of pockets of warm water, but they're not going to become invasive because they can't spread from those points. But they are there, and it just sort of shows that guppies are jumping on opportunities. As soon as they're introduced, they're just waiting for the conditions to be right. In this questionnaire, I also tried to find out some information about why they've been introduced. And this showed me that it's about 50-50 between mosquito control and aquarium releases. And in many countries, it's a combination of those two routes of introduction. So in conclusion, it seems that just one single wild female can establish an invasive population with potentially devastating ecological consequences. This is worrying because the guppy is one of the most popular, if not the most popular aquarium species worldwide in tropical aquaria. And it shows that even a child seemingly harmlessly releasing one unwanted pet fish could actually have quite severe implications for biodiversity. Thank you very much for listening.